Hello YouTube, I'd like to discuss my thoughts on the currently ongoing Wall Street protests, the Occupy Wall Street protests. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with these protests, approximately 2 months ago, a group by the name of Adbusters began to organize them. Adbusters is a counterculture news magazine. I believe their website is adbusters.org. I believe they're also a social network of some sort because they have 90,000 plus members. In any case, they, along with Anonymous, the hacker group that many of you may be familiar with, began to organize these protests. And they wanted 20,000 people to descend on Manhattan, to descend on Wall Street today, Saturday, September 17th, 2011, to protest the undue influence that money has on Wall Street, to demand that Obama set up a committee to end the inordinate influence that money has on the presidential campaign. Sorry, not Wall Street. That was a bit redundant. The inordinate influence that money has on the presidential campaigns, as well as simply, to decrease the rich-poor gap. And there were not several clearly articulated aims. There was that one aim put out by Adbusters, I believe, that said that the inordinate amount of influence of money on Washington is something that needs to be done away with on the presidential campaign on Washington generally. But in addition, you know, individuals clearly all over the country are upset over the social stratification that's increased massively over the past 30 years. That is the rich-poor gap. That is, a tiny elite having a substantial percentage of the nation's wealth. And, along with the unemployment numbers, obviously, which goes part and parcel with that. So, and a part of the general idea was to create a forum, create a democratically organized assembly of sorts, whereby individuals could air their grievances and whereby individuals could attempt to work with one another to figure out ways in which the variety of problems that pertain to economic injustice in this country could begin to be solved, a springboard to form some sort of a movement that will attempt to address these issues. Now, various other cities have organized these protests as well. The main one was supposed to be in Manhattan beginning today, but there were protests organized in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Austin, Texas, in London, in Paris. So this has become a worldwide movement of sorts, if you want to call it that started with some individuals wanting to organize a protest in Wall Street in New York City. Now, the organizers were expecting 20,000 people. Ultimately, only approximately 1,000, possibly a little bit more, possibly 2,000, showed up today. And they marched, and I don't know precisely how many showed up in London, Paris, San Francisco, Austin, Texas, etc., etc. I have not read much about those protests yet, but I do know that, as stated, 1 to 2,000 showed up in New York City, and they marched, and they ultimately began to occupy or did not begin to occupy, began to enter. It was illegal at this point, so I suppose it cannot be termed an occupation, but they began to conglomerate in this park in New York City, close to Wall Street, and began to conduct people's assemblies, whereby they got in circles, about, I believe, 10 circles, 8 to 10 large circles, and began to discuss their demands, their aims, etc., etc. Now, at about 7 p.m., the police began to tell them that they would not be allowed to remain in this area because it was owned by a corporation. However, after brainstorming for a few hours about alternative plans, did they want to stage a sit-in? Did they want to go somewhere else, such as the sidewalks where they legally be allowed to stay? Ultimately, the police decided to let the protesters stay in this park, even though the city park closes at 10 p.m. and they were not allowed to be there. So the protest is allowed to persist. They didn't have to relocate. The 1,000 or so protesters are remaining overnight, are sleeping overnight in this park. Now, of course, this is modeled. I should have mentioned this is modeled after the Tahrir Square protest, the Madrid protest, the various protests that we've seen over the past 6 to 9 months or so, 6 to 10 months. I don't know precisely. These attempts to create a mass movement. Obviously, this so far is not remotely close to on the same scale as that of Egypt, etc. But that's a brief overview. Now I want to share my thoughts. So I will start with the pros. I think that it is good that people are attempting to provide an alternative model to the traditional cutthroat model of our society in terms of a means of conducting affairs, in terms of a means of getting things accomplished. The fact that they're doing this largely consensus based or in a somewhat democratic fashion, at least far more democratic than a bunch of so-called representatives who you vote for. This is individuals who have a direct stake in the world they want to see and who are discussing with one another the various ways in which they can see that world realized. So I think this provides a very good model for a healthy society, for a society that's based on taking into account the values and the aspirations and desires of all people in that society. Obviously, in this case, it's only the people who decided to attend this Occupy Wall Street event, but I think the model there is absolutely admirable and something that we should strive for. In addition, all social movements start somewhere, and I feel that it's good that this anti-Wall Street movement is beginning. That's about as far as it goes in terms of the positives. In terms of the negatives, or in terms of my skepticism, look at Tahrir Square. Look at the fact that millions of people occupied the square for weeks, and yet still substantial lasting change has yet to emerge. So, and look at the fact that there are only 1,000 people, which is absolutely pathetic in terms of, if you look at past social movements, 1,000 people cannot create fundamental societal change in the face of a increasingly militarized police force, in the face of a well-entrenched Wall Street that wants to maintain its status quo. So, my hope lies in the potential for it to grow, and the fact that it's a starting point, and the fact that it provides a model. But my skepticism and cynicism stems from what it currently is, and the fact that it is not currently they're not currently in a position to make any fundamental demands. The police could round up everyone and arrest them. Perhaps that would spur more dissent, and perhaps that would work to their disadvantage, but if the police really wanted to, they could crush this quote-unquote revolt. They could crush this dissent rather rapidly. So if it doesn't escalate, and if people don't begin to find ways to actually fundamentally threaten the status quo, then it's not going to be successful, and it's not going to accomplish anything whatsoever in the long term. So that's really, in essence, what I wanted to say. I oppose the dogmatic, nonviolent ethos of the march. Like, tactically, at this point, it absolutely makes sense for them to remain nonviolent right now. There's only 1,000 people. They don't want to just get rounded up instantly and demonized by the media. So, I'm not condemning the fact that it stayed nonviolent so far, but I do criticize the fact that some of the organizers are pushing this dogmatic nonviolence. We need to stay nonviolent. We need to stay nonviolent at all times because violence is inherently wrong. They haven't stated that outright, but that's the implication, and I disagree that violence is inherently wrong. I think there are certain circumstances where it can be tactically more effective and ultimately beneficial from a social justice standpoint, from a improving society for the betterment of people, to create a healthier society standpoint. So I do take a little bit of issue with that. But tactically, so far, the fact that the protesters are staying within the law, not even engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, That even makes sense to me. I don't think they should stage a sit-in even at this point because um, they simply don't have enough people. The police will simply arrest them, and that will be the end of it. And it would be nice if it persisted for at least a few more days, which would be enough time to acquire a sufficient number to perhaps, accomplish something, if minor. I'm not optimistic. Things are so bad at this point, on a variety of fronts in a societal scale. So I'm not. I don't have my hopes. My hopes are not high. I'm not. I'm rather cynical about the outcome of this. It's still nice to see people attempting something. It's still nice to see people working together to accomplish something in the society that values rugged individual cutthroat competition above communal community forming and communal goal achievement. The other thing I wanted to say is the fact that people always focus on those who want a better society. Typically, focus on the societal and economic problems, and oftentimes issues like foreign policy, such as the illegal occupations of Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. You see all these massive protests with regard to social, or massive. I mean, certainly they should be far, far, far more massive than they are. But every now and then you see these large protests in the United States that pertain to social, economic, or foreign policy issues. And my concern is that throughout history there have been economic, social, and foreign policy protests. Protests against the status quo in all three of those realms. But what we're not noticing, what seems to be quietly, subtly altering the very fabric of our society for the worse, is these civil liberties violations and the gradual turning of our society into a complete police state. And, you can have all of the protests against foreign policy and all of the protests against economic problems that you want, and you can even make some fundamental gains. But if the police state continues to escalate unabated, if we continue to descend down this dark road into the abyss of Orwellian hell, if we continue to let these iris scanners be rolled out and these checkpoints where the TSA has carte blanche to do whatever the fuck they want to you, short of rape. If we continue to let these things occur, this amounts to a terrorism on a mass scale. It amounts to, government terrorism on a mass scale, government psychological terrorism on a mass scale, and it alters the very morality of, I've stated in the past, and you begin to normalize the abuse. And my concern is that first of all, you won't be able to protest anymore when they've inserted us all into a database and can track us wherever we go and can shoot us whenever they feel like it. You won't be able to protest about the wars. You won't be able to protest about the economy. You go to protest, and they'll gun you down. They'll round you up if you post anything remotely resembling a threat to the status quo. They'll gun you down and they'll round you up because they'll have iris scanners wherever you go. They'll have molestation by the TSA wherever you go, and if you don't submit to molestation, then then you'll be denied access to all buildings and eventually, be unable to move in our society. So, that brings me to my second point, which is that if you normalize psychological terrorism on a personal level, if they set up checkpoints everywhere and start molesting people everywhere and start surveilling people everywhere, then that's going to dehumanize people to the extent that, and traumatize people to the extent that they're not going to care about the illegal wars. I mean, do you understand? I'm not articulating this very clearly, and I have 30 seconds left, but essentially what I'm saying is that if you submit to violation and normalize and are conditioned to tolerate violation on such a visceral, personal level, then you're going to be fundamentally less human and you're going to be fundamentally less concerned about the larger societal issues that are more abstract.